Hello, grade 10. Welcome back to our English class. For week 5, quarter 3, the episode's focus is on literary approach in assessing a literary piece through Marxism. For the most essential learning competency, you have to critique a literary selection based on Marxism. In this lesson, you will discover another literary approach that you will use as lens in critiquing a text later. When we say Marxism, it is a cultural theory that embodies a set of social, economic, and political ideas that its followers believe will enable them to interpret and change their world. Marxist critics are also interested in how the lower or working classes are oppressed in everyday life and in literature. Let us now take a look on how it all began. Karl Marx, the proponent of this theory, lived in London at the time of industrialization and traveled extensively through Europe. He saw a highly developed continent where the tensions ran high because of social inequality. According to Marx, social inequality was a consequence of the arrival of the division of labor and, moreover, was what had led to the class society. Since literature reflects economics, politics, the kind of people and their society where they live in, one literary piece can be subject to analysis not in its feature elements and devices, but in its contents, style of the writer in developing the plot, and to the extent of the background as a compelling contributing factor to the overall effect of the whole story. In doing a Marxist literary criticism, one must look for the following details. Social classes that constitute the setting of the story, like the importance and role to run the plot and in injecting ideas. Characteristics of such social classes, as to how social classes interact each other and make conflicts between or among social classes. Author's idea about the prevailing social issue like oppression, and technique of the author in using the social conflicts. Resolving the embedded issue or problem. Author's message on the issue or problem, whether stated directly through characters or merely implied. Another is the author's main purpose of writing the story, far from entertaining the reader. Another consideration is the background of the author and his views on economy, politics, and society. Lastly, is the place where the literary piece was written, time period, culture, traditions, practices, economy, and politics that might have influenced one literary piece. One of the best examples of literary piece injected with Marxism theory is the 1997 movie Titanic. This movie makes the class struggle obvious. It portrays differences in classes and struggle among them. The ship itself represents the class struggle, showing the first-class passengers on the upper decks and the third-class passengers unable to reach the higher decks. This is good use of positioning a metaphor for the struggle of reaching the heights of the ruling classes. As for the two main characters, Rose and Jack are completely opposite. Rose is a rich young woman who has everything she could want. On the other hand, Jack has nothing. At the beginning of the film, he is trying to gamble his way to America by trying to win third-class tickets in a poker game. The way the different classes are treated by the bourgeoisie or the middle class is obvious in the scenes depicting the sinking of the ship, where the ruling class orders that the third-class passengers are to be locked in the lower decks, while the first-class passengers have the chance to get aboard the lifeboats. Now that you already have a picture of Marxism in your mind, it's time for you to read an interesting summary of a play. The author is none other than an American playwright, Edward Albee. Edward Albee is considered as the foremost American playwright of his generation, who introduced himself with a bang in 1959, when his first produced one-act play entitled The Zoo Story opened in Berlin. This is about an isolated young man who is desperate to interact with other people. The skyrocketing launch of this play helped propel the blossoming theater movement that became known as Off-Broadway. Now, here we go. The Zoo Story by Edward Albee. One Sunday afternoon, a well-dressed man named Peter, wearing tweed and a smoking pipe, is an upper middle-class family man and publishing executive in his mid-40s, is reading a book on a bench. Jerry, a sloppily dressed transient in his late 30s, approaches and announces that he is coming from the Central Park Zoo. Despite Peter's apparent reluctance to chat, Jerry strikes up a conversation. Jerry's forward personality quickly begins to annoy Peter. He points out that Peter will likely to get cancer from smoking, and implies that Peter is emasculated because he has cats instead of dogs. Jerry continues to ask Peter questions about his life, his job, and his interest. When Peter finally begins to return Jerry's questions, Jerry tells him about his miserable apartment in a flop house on the Upper West Side. He describes his unsavory neighbors and the junk that compromises his possessions, including 2 empty picture frames. When Peter asks him about the picture frames, Jerry explains that he is completely alone in life. His parents died when he was young, and his only significant romantic relationship was a short liaison he had with another boy when he was a teenager. Jerry promises to tell Peter about his trip to the zoo, but is sidetracked into telling Peter about his landlady, a drunken woman who constantly offers him. When she got a dog, Jerry tried to befriend it, but the dog responded only by attacking him. After repeated and repudiated attempts of friendship, Jerry decided to murder the dog by feeding it a poisoned hamburger patty. Although this sickened the dog, it eventually recovered and began to simply leave him alone. Peter finds this story extremely disturbing and wonders why Jerry told it to him. Jerry explains that he tries to befriend animals as a gateway to befriending other people. Peter tries to excuse himself, but Jerry tickles him to keep him from leaving. He then tries to force Peter to move from the bench and punches him when he refuses. Although Peter initially realizes that Jerry's behavior is absurd, he gradually becomes more possessive of the bench. Unexpectedly, Jerry pulls a knife and insists Peter to fight for it. This shocks Peter, who refuses to fight. As a gesture of peace, Jerry gives the knife to Peter, who holds the knife out to protect himself. When Peter holds the knife defensively, Jerry charges him and impales himself on the knife. Although he is initially hysterical, Jerry soon calms down and accepts his death. He even thanks Peter, using his last energy to wipe Peter's fingerprints off the knife handle so that Peter will not be accused of his murder. Peter takes his book and dashes off before passers-by notice that Jerry is dying. That ends the zoo story. For your performance output, you have to critique the zoo story based on Marxist lens. By then, you may continue accomplishing learning task 1 to 5 and quiz number 5. That's all for this week. Happy learning. Keep safe, everyone.